Janet Schofield. I'm the planning manager for school networks at Ministry of Education. I manage the planning team at Ministry of Education. My emphasis is on planning for growth in the Auckland region across the school sector. So because Auckland is a fast growing region, we need lots of new schools and more classrooms across our network. So we did quite a lot of demand analysis to try and work out where that new capacity should go.
So hi everybody, I'm the lead analyst for planning in Janet's team. My job really is the behind the scenes numbers. So a lot of my work is around forecasting demand for schooling and schooling networks around the country, but especially in Auckland, which is a particularly interesting case.
It is. It's got about 60% of the growth of the country. So we're involved with our colleagues in Wellington and the other regions as well. And we particularly talk to the other growth regions. So that would be Queenstown, Wellington, Christchurch, Tauranga, and particularly Hamilton. Mm-hmm. But Auckland's definitely the biggest in terms of growth numbers. Where is the growth in Auckland? Do we know where it is? What data and information do we use to try and determine what growth there is? How many new schools does Auckland need? That's a really curly question. And the answer is we keep adding, finding more places where we might need, more growth areas where we may potentially need to put completely new schools. What do we do with existing schools? A lot of our schools are really old. So a lot of them were built in like 40s and 50s. Then we had weather tightness issues at the same time that all the housing stock had weather tightness issues as well. And then we've got growth on top of that. So it's a bit of a triple whammy that the region is trying to recover from. So we'll talk about that. And hopefully by the time we get to the end of this session, we might have answered some of these questions for you. You'll have a good idea about it. Will practices and environments for education change? And what about policy settings? That's a really good question in the COVID timeframe, because we've seen quite a lot of changes as a result of everybody being locked down with a lot of learning going online. And for that context, I'm talking about particularly about schools. So trying to put all of their education programs online for digital learning. And will that actually, we've speculated quite a lot about whether we will continue to be building schools of the size we have at the moment, and whether some of that secondary education could possibly move online. And then giving you some idea of how we work with schools around things like enrolment schemes.
So obviously at a national level, the ministry is working across the whole of the nation and has a responsibility to provide across the country and to fit its budgetary constraints. We like to think, because we have a very Auckland focus, that Auckland should be getting the lion's share of everything, but we have to fight for our quarter as everyone else does. So the regional level of that hierarchy is us. Even at an Auckland level, it's still a big beast and really unmanageable to deal with in one big hit. So we broke Auckland down into what we're referring to as planning catchments. So we've got 20 catchments, which we felt was a manageable number. They're primarily made up of networks of schools, which you might liken to the next level down, the communities of learning, kahuiako. So the kahuiako are schools of like mind that work together, that feed each other, and form networks of schools that children can work their way through as they get older. And of course, the finest level of detail is the school itself. So we've got 565 schools in Auckland that we have currently. So what's driving our need for growth, or why do we have to add anything to our networks or catchments? So there's two dominant drivers behind growth in Auckland. The orange bars that you can see on that graph show natural increase, which is just the difference between births and deaths. The blue is the interesting, that's migration. It's new people coming into Auckland. So you can see that the natural increase has overall been the dominant force, and it's been a fairly steady driver for growth throughout the last 100 years, I suppose. You can see it's a reasonably linear growth and fairly predictable. The curly one is the blue. So migration has probably increased over time, but what you see is back in the early 1900s, it was reasonably steady. It kind of followed a similar path to the natural increase and was a little bit more predictable. And then towards the mid-70s, you see it dip down into the negative. So we had migration out of Auckland at that point, and it was driving a shrinkage of Auckland. And from there on in, you see it start to bounce up and down. And it sort of looks like a wave that's getting less and less stable over time with bigger swings. So at the moment, or just recently, when this graph was drawn, we were at the peak of probably the highest immigration into Auckland. just towards the end of the 20-teens, around 2017, 18, 19. You see it peak up there. Everyone was clamoring and say, oh my God, growth in Auckland is dreadful. How will anyone cope? And Stats New Zealand was assuring us it has to come down. And a lot of us would gang up on Stats and say, don't be ridiculous. Look, it's enormous. How can it possibly come down? It's going to stay up there. And they're quite right. If you look at history, you see it reach these peaks, and it has to come down because those peaks are not sustainable over a long period of time. And we did, in fact, see it start to come down, and we saw government change immigration policy to start driving it down. The blue to the right sort of looks a bit smooth. That's kind of an ideal scenario that Stats say, well, it will kind of revert to its long-term average. And that's sort of the most you can work with. You can't say what the swings will do, but you can say on average it's going to be about like this. So this is quite an old slide now, but it shows how birth rates change over time. You can see that they fluctuate, but what the pattern there, as you see, this is covering the global financial crisis period, and you can see there was a sharp rise in birth rates, and it stayed high for some years afterwards. The importance of this one to us was that birth rates rise, and 5 years later we have an increase in enrolments at primary school, which is quite predictable. And so it's quite important for us as planning education to have a weather eye on birth rates.
It does also, though, I mean, so it fluctuates around the sort of 22,000 births a year, doesn't it? So it just goes up and down around that level, and it's reasonably consistent.
Yeah.
But yeah, the pattern does flow through into school age cohorts as well.
We call it a bubble. So you get this inflated birth rate, and then you get that blip move through the age ranges. So 5 years later, as I said, you see that rise appear at primary school, and 8 years after that you start to see that bubble move on to secondary school, and you see that bulge move through the system and out the other end. So the trick is, if it's not a sustainably high birth rate, then you know it's going to move through and come out the other end. If it goes up and stays up, you know you're going to have to permanently accommodate them, and you'll need a bigger system. So it can affect whether you need a permanent or a temporary response to what's going on. So this is looking at Stats New Zealand projections for Auckland's population, going back to their projections from the 70s. So the lower left-hand corner were their projections from 1976. And as we move up and to the right, we have more recent forecasting. And what you notice is that generally each renewal of the stats forecasts, the line gets slightly steeper, which kind of suggests that whatever they'd forecast the population would be, the reality was actually slightly higher or faster than that projection had indicated. So each successive renewal of the projections is steeper and is starting generally from a higher point than they'd anticipated. One of the really scary ones is the black line at the top right-hand corner. So with the last census and their projections, they'd undercooked some of the forecasting, and that 2013 count had part of the effect of the GFC in it, but not all of it. And the black line is a revision of the purple line, which was substantially lifted to accommodate that change in thinking. So that was a bit of a scary one. You can argue two things on this. One, you could say that actually Stats has consistently under-projected reality, or what happens afterwards. Another way to look at it might be that Stats is actually lagging behind the current trend. So if this was a downward trend, for example, as happened to London at one point in its history, then you might argue that they would be over-projecting, and the reality is heading downwards faster than they're correcting. Because we're in a growing Auckland, we're seeing that they're under-projecting. The one thing you do see, though, is that growth is pretty much relentless at the moment. Even if you look around where the global financial crisis was, where you might expect that people might find somewhere else to live while they're feeling not so flush, we still saw significant growth in Auckland. It didn't stop, it didn't flatten out, it didn't go down. It carried on, it just didn't carry on quite as fast as previously, and it very quickly picked up again afterwards.
What this does tell us, though, I think, is it's very clear that Auckland's on the same growth as most international cities. So we're not, so when we look at New Zealand growth, we're probably on quite a different pattern to some of the other cities in New Zealand. So we certainly haven't got the same trends around ageing population. Well, we have got ageing population, but we've also got quite a young population at the other end of the spectrum. So we would expect this trend to continue and probably to accelerate. And the other thing that you notice here is that this is the median projection. So it does tell us that, yes, our suspicion that we were tracking closer to the high projection rather than the medium is correct. So we use this type of information to successfully argue that for the growth cities in New Zealand, we should be using the high projection from Stats New Zealand, not the medium projection. So all of our forecasts have previously been done on the medium projection, and we now, for growth areas, use the high projection, because our biggest risk is underestimating, not overestimating.
So this is really looking at how imprecise forecasting can be. So what you're seeing there, the red and the green and the blue lines on there are tracking what the high, medium and low scenarios are from the Stats New Zealand data that we receive. So the black dotted line on the left is our actual July roll returns. So those are actuals. And then we're projecting stats forecasts onto that at a high, medium and low scenario. And the blue block behind is the capacity that our system had at the time that this was drawn. So you could see that actual rolls fitted within capacity, that was good, but that it was starting to get pretty full. And then you look at the projections going forward, and you think, well, if it goes at the low scenario, we might get away with it. The medium scenario, we might get away for a little while, but we're going to have to make the whole thing bigger. And the high scenario, it just is scary, because that blows out, well, it has blown out pretty much current, and it grows and grows and grows from there on in. So we've got a big job ahead of us. So this is indicating, so you look at the gap between, say, the medium and the high scenario, and it's a big gap. There's 70,000 kids difference there. And there's sort of nearly 80,000 difference between the low and the medium. So there's this huge range that the student population could be within that broad range. And so you've got to pick, well, where are we going to go with that? What are we going to land on? Each classroom is hundreds of thousands of dollars if we get it wrong. So our growth plan for Auckland, obviously we had to pick a number and pitch for people to support that and to fund it and what have you. And 60,000 was the number that we went with, which is sort of above medium. It's below high, but it's a supportable number. And that's the growth that we are planning towards for 2030. Traditionally, what normally happens is the number probably doesn't go up, but it happens sooner over time, if history is anything to go by. But that's what we're planning to for 2030 at the moment. And so we've got Auckland as a system in its own right. So we've got the Auckland Education Growth Plan, because it's the largest education system in New Zealand, and it's also the fastest growing. It's the most full. It sweats its assets the hardest. So it's also the most diverse. But so this is where it's going to happen. If we can get Auckland right, we can roll that out across the rest of the growth areas in New Zealand, which are behind us but growing significantly. So Auckland is really marked out by this scale, complexity, diversity more than any other city in New Zealand, I think, or probably any other region in New Zealand. So we've got a big system that's growing in big chunks. We come across arguments that say, oh, Auckland's only growing at 1.5%, 2%, or 3% or whatever. And they forget that 3% of this many people is a hell of a lot of people. So growth in terms of bodies, sorry, bad choice of words, people, is enormous. It's a low rate, but it's a huge number that we're going to have to accommodate and to educate and everything else to do with the city. We have the greatest diversity in terms of socioeconomic factors. So we used to have a measure of schools, the decile system, which was related to a deprivation index from health. And we have more at the extremes of that scale than anywhere else in New Zealand. So we have more of the poorest and more of the richest in one place. So we have to be able to accommodate that huge diversity. And then we have a greater mix of ethnic groups in Auckland than anywhere else, and greater numbers than anywhere else probably as well. But it's a big deal. And so if we want to get it right for education for all of these groups, we have to get it right in Auckland. And then if it works in Auckland, chances are some variation of that may well work elsewhere in New Zealand. So it's vitally important that we get this right. So, no pressure.
So we're also working on Maori Medium Network Plan, Pacific Medium Network Plan, learning support. There's all sorts of, we've created this very, very complex system. So we've got a whole series of kura, rumaki, punareo. We've also got different types and sizes of schools. We've got integrated schools, designated character schools. We've got primary schools, intermediate schools, secondary schools, high schools, junior colleges. A lot of our groups of schools, networks of schools are not consistent. They mix full primary and contributing primary schools with intermediate schools. So all of that makes it really difficult. And then we've got private schools. So there's quite a interchange of different systems going on, and it can be quite difficult to get your head around. Then we've got out-of-zone movements of students not enrolling in their local school. So not only, so all we've talked about to start with here is that our base information is the Statistics New Zealand data and projections, but you have to kind of overlay that with what's happening with the enrolment scheme patterns, what's happening with the different year levels. It just gets really complicated very quickly, and then you've got all these diversity factors on top of that.
So from the 2013 based projections, this was looking at census area units and how they might grow over the period to 2043. And so basically that's saying if it's green, yeah, it's about the same. We're only looking at school age, actually just primary school age kids at this point, by census area unit. If it's green, it's going to be about the same. If it's blue and tending towards darker blue, it's shrinking, and the darker the blue, the bigger the decline. The first thing you notice is there's not a hell of a lot of blue on that map. And then oranges and reds are growth. And where you see that beautiful shade of pink there, that's 1,000 or more additional primary age kids in that area unit, just that area unit. So, and then, you know, they're not massive area units, but that's a hell of a lot of kids. So you might say, well, that's 1 or 2 primary schools worth just in that area unit. So that's quite significant growth. And this is actually slightly aged information. There's a lot of developments that have sprung up since this data was available, which is why we're very excitedly looking forward to the update. So what it shows, so this is purely from the population forecasting perspective. This doesn't include any data from anywhere else, it's purely stats. But the first thing you see is, well, the growth is kind of everywhere. It's distributed right the way across Auckland. The real sort of pink areas you see in the very bright red and orange areas, there's a lot of those in greenfield areas around the periphery of the dense areas. But then there's also lots of intensification in existing areas. We really have to, you know, we can't respond to all of that in one go. We have to know what's going first, when it's going, and what our response needs to be to those, and when it has to be in place. So, you know, I guess the thing is, we can say, you know, we know roughly what's going to happen and where. Often the big question is exactly when. So you can imagine you invest in a new school and it's tens of millions of dollars that you've just spent. If it's sitting in the middle of an empty field for 5 years, it's going to look pretty silly on the front page of the Herald. Likewise, if you need to build a school and you're 5 years late and there's kids piling into anywhere else they can go, that doesn't look much better either. So the timing's really important. Another unique feature of education is that primary schools in particular don't really pull kids from huge areas. They have quite focused catchments, focused enrollment areas, and that's quite deliberate, because if you've got young children, you'd like them to walk to school ideally, and really don't want them to have to walk 5 kilometres at 5 years old. They don't want to have to walk that far. So we have to be quite precise about where we're going to put it and when we're going to put it.
What this illustrated when we first did this was the first time we sort of mapped growth across the region. We consistently get asked, well, which are your top 5 catchments? Okay, so we have 20 catchments in Auckland region, and we consistently have to say, we've got a top 18, we haven't got a top 20. So as Nick just said, there's growth everywhere. It's not all of our catchments have got growth, they're all growth catchments. So that's the reality. And if you zoom in on some of those areas in the isthmus, for example, they may look small, but there's large numbers of children, population growth in those areas. So this was really our first look. This is a sort of a starting point for trying to figure out, so with growth, where, when, and how's it going to occur? So this is the where. So we're pretty clear on where the growth is going to be. As Nick said, the when is a lot more difficult. When we started this exercise about 3 years ago, there was a whole lot of excitement about special housing areas. So government had brought in the Auckland Housing Accords, and there were, I think, 151 special housing areas proposed for Auckland region. Of those, some of the larger ones definitely went ahead. So we got all quite worried about these special housing areas. They haven't turned out to be quite such a driver. They were intended to speed up growth. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Then what we're trying to do here by identifying the growth drivers is actually, are there any developments over and above the stats projections that stats didn't know about that we need to take into account, that we might need to add on top of our projections? So we look at special housing areas. We might go and meet with very large scale private developers, find out what they're doing. We refer to the Auckland Unitary Plan, the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy, which hasn't been updated yet, so it's still the current information. And then we meet with various other government agencies. So Kaina Ora, we know that they've got development areas in Hobsonville, Northcote, Mount Roskill, Mangere, and Oranga. We meet with TRC, Tamaki Redevelopment Company, and and actually Kaina Ora also involved there as well, and Housing and Urban Development at Unitec. So we're aware of a lot of those special housing areas. There's kind of a mixture. They're in greenfield areas at the edge of the city, or they're in existing brownfield areas. And then we have always public housing as well. So we're trying to track all of those development areas across the city.